you so much for being here, especially it's a cold day, so I really appreciate you coming out. Yeah, maybe just so the slides show better. And thank you so much, Deborah, for having me back. I know you had, some of you might have been here a couple weeks ago for my former colleague, recently retired Professor Rob. I know he's a really tough act to follow because he is such a great speaker, so I will try to keep you as entertained as George did. So I'm here today to talk to you about women's roles at Dye Mansion during the revolutionary era of the pandemic, right? So in 2020, in the fall, I partnered with the folks at Dye Mansion, right down the road, to do a series of virtual field trips. So we collaborated to do these virtual field trips for them, so that they could still have programming available while they were closed, as well as for the William Patterson University community. We typically do an annual lecture every year, and obviously we weren't able to do it. So I did a very brief segment on women's roles in Dye Mansion. If you just Google Dye Mansion field trip, you can find it, right? It's still up there along with the other videos. And then this past academic year, I further partnered with the folks at Dye Mansion to do an interpretive plan. They're very interested in expanding their programming and exhibits on women's history, especially with the 250th anniversary of American independence is coming up in just a couple of years. So I did a deeper dive into the research, and so a lot of what I'm going to be sharing today comes out of that larger interpretive plan that I did for them. But I just want to express my gratitude both to the Wayne Library for having me here, but also for Dye Mansion. It's been so much fun partnering with them. And, they're right down the road. So if you haven't been there, I strongly encourage you to go. They had been closed for a while, first in the pandemic, and then they had some construction, which ran late, so, but I think they are now reopened, so I really do hope that you get there, so that's my plug for them. So one of the reasons Dye Mansion exists and is on the National Historic Register is because for 3 months on 2 separate occasions since 1780, it served as the military headquarters for General George Washington, right? So this is the part of the history that we know, that makes this place historically significant. It's a good reminder of the centrality of New Jersey to the American Revolutionary story writ large, right? That New Jersey was, as many scholars have pointed out, at the crossroads of the American Revolution, right? So much activity, battles, military engagement took place here in New Jersey. And I kind of love this map, this old map that I found. I think it's from 1777, yep. Because it doesn't even call it New Jersey. It just kind of shows how New Jersey doesn't get enough respect. Something I'm pushing back against. It says an accurate plan of the country between New York and Philadelphia. So it's like New Jersey is this site where so much is happening, so much important stuff, but even when they're mapping it out, we're just the place between New York and Philadelphia. And often that is the way scholars, especially scholars working at the national level, have kind of treated New Jersey as just that place in between. But luckily we do have wonderful scholars who are working to expand the narrative and really make sure that New Jersey has a more central place. As I said, the 250th anniversary of 1776 is coming up, and the people at the New Jersey Historical Society are already hard at work with programming and stuff. Maxine Laurie, who's a retired professor from Seton Hall, has just published a whole new book on New Jersey and the Revolution. So, we're starting to get our due as an actual place, not just the place in between, right? So New Jersey is central, to the story of the American Revolution. And what I want to talk to you today is the way in which Dye Mansion, when Washington arrives there first in the summer and then in the fall of 1780, this place now is taking on 2 roles, right? It is a family home. It is a family residence, right? It's where people live, but it's also now a military headquarters, right? And so how do we, how does that actually work, right? So instead of just looking at Dye Mansion in terms of it's important because George Washington was there, to really kind of take a much closer look on the ground and figure out what that would have meant, particularly for the family and the women in the family. Christmas is coming, Thanksgiving just happened, we might have had relatives in town for a couple of days, right? imagine not just your relatives showing up, but an entire army showing up, and saying, we're going to stay here for a month. Like, hello, So obviously, at the time, the home was home to Colonel Tunis and Di and his wife Hester. They were very active in the revolutionary cause and the patriot cause. Tunis Di was a colonel in the New Jersey, local state militia. So they were very happy to welcome Washington, to support the war effort. But, just think about the chaos it must have created to have, Washington, his trusted advisors, people like Hamilton and other people. Lafayette stayed just up the road, had a similar headquarters. Washington always traveled with his lifeguard, with his sort of bodyguards, and then his many troops, right? So just imagine how much patience and fortitude it would have taken to suddenly have your home become a military headquarters, right? And the hustle and bustle, right? There would be visitors, officers, staff, messengers constantly coming in and out, sort of creating chaos, right? And this is just a slide of the door. I'll have some other slides showing what the house would have actually looked like and how the spaces would have been used. But before I get into sort of the nitty gritty of what it would have been like as a military headquarters / family home, I think it's really important to just sort of take a quick step back and sort of look at what women were expected to be doing at this time, their roles, and then how having, the house transformed into a military headquarters would have transformed or shaken those things up a little bit. So I want to start with a brief overview of women's activities before, during, and after the war to sort of help set the stage and to help really understand the important roles that women played, both the Di women's particular in, supporting Washington and his troops, but also this is part of a larger story of the really important but often overlooked ways in which women were essential to, the success of the American Revolutionary Movement. Okay, so the most important thing to remember is that 18th century households would have required a great deal of physical labor to maintain, right? No refrigerators, no heating, no indoor plumbing, no microwave ovens, all the sort of things that we take for granted to help make life a little bit easier are not present, right? So 18th century households are very busy sites of production, right? They are places where stuff to eat, right, to need to be produced, and this requires a great deal of labor, right? So one of my favorite images that represents this is not from the Di Mansion per se, but it's a very kind of within historical circles. It's a pretty well-known image from 1733 or approximately there. So. And it's called the Van Bergen Overmantel for a farm that's right in upstate New York, I believe. But it's a Dutch-style home, so kind of very similar to the kind of, we see a lot of Dutch architecture throughout this area in particular, because New Jersey was settled first by the Dutch and then by the English and even the Di family. They are a family with Dutch roots. So I love this image because it kind of shows that an 18th century home is a residence, but it is also a very busy place, right? There's a lot of work taking place outside the home to tend the crops, the animals, all the kind of work that goes into an 18th century home. And I kind of want to talk about the particular roles that women would have played for this, right? So we start in the kitchen, right? Because, as we say, a woman's work is never done, right? And most of that work in the 18th century would have taken place in the kitchen. So, and these are all, now this is Di Mansion, and most of the images I'll be showing are directly from Di Mansion, generously shared with them. The exhibits might look a little bit different because, like as I said, they were closed for a while and now they're reopening, so they might have staged things differently for the reopening. But it gives you a general gist of things. So you'll see, here is the hearth, right? This is where the meals would be cooked, right? You'll see there's a kettle there, but there's also these kind of nifty sort of baking ovens. That's where you would bake your bread or keep things warm, right? And you can see that the colonial kitchen is a utilitarian place, right? This is where you would have like your sturdier stuff, right? Like The plates are pewter, right? The utensils are metal, copper, right? This is not where you're going to put like your fine stuff, right? And that's kind of part of the story, is that a household in the 18th century would have these very practical utilitarian places for the work, but then they would also have places where there'd be a more emphasis on social rituals, right, of sort of showing off, right, if you will, right? In the 18th century, the Dye family is one of the most wealthy elite families in the 18th century in this area of New Jersey. Everything in their home would be designed to sort of showcase their status, right? To showcase their wealth and their kind of place in the community. And so here in the family parlor is where you would have the more decorative items, right? The things that would signify, this is where you would have your company, for example, right? If someone came over to visit, you wouldn't bring them into your kitchen. Nowadays, I feel like everyone's always in my kitchen, and I'm like, get out, I'm trying to cook, right? In the 18th century, your guests would not go to your kitchen, right? They would go to your family parlor, right? And that's where you would have your best furnishings, your fancier plates and dishes. It would be a space of elegance, of ritualistic comfort, right? And this would be also the place that was central for the family, right? Whether they were home alone or entertaining guests, this would be the place where you would gather together in the evening, perhaps to listen to music, perhaps someone would read from a book aloud, perhaps a woman might be sitting there knitting while, conversations were going on, or cards were being played, or games. So it was really a place of ease and comfort and sociability, but also a place meant to impress, right? Meant to sort of show off to your guest and your neighbors and your company, right? And these are just some other images, not from Dye Mansion, just sort of showing what typical 18th century parlors would have looked like at the time. So you can see that the Dye Mansion was very much sort of in line with expectations. This is actually from Mount Vernon, George Washington's home in Virginia. I thought it'd be interesting to see what his house actually looked like, as opposed to kind of where he was when he was staying. Now, why do I go into such great detail about this? Because it's actually such an important part of the story, both leading up to the Revolution and women's roles in the Revolution itself. Because both the utilitarian parts of the family kitchen, as well as, the more decorative social rituals of the parlor, require lots and lots of stuff, right? So in the 18th century, there is an explosion of, some scholars refer to as a consumer revolution, right? Where Americans are just in love with stuff in the 18th century, right? Like, Christmas is coming, right? So this is nothing new for us, right? But it might be new to know that even 250 years ago, we still loved our stuff, right? The difference is, couldn't go to Willowbrook Mall, right, to do your shopping, right? Mostly everything that existed in a colonial home, such as the Dye family home, would have been imported from England, right? It might have come from China first, but normally it would come from another part of the world, go through England, and then be shipped to the colonies, right? Because in the 18th century, the colonies existed to serve England, right? So trade was meant to benefit England, right? So if the colonists wanted stuff, it was all supposed to travel through England, right? And this is a very big, important part of the story of the coming of the American Revolution. And of course, then and now, women play a really important role as consumers, as deciding what stuff is going to be showcased in their family home, is going to sort of show that status and wealth to their community, to their families, right? And that's particularly true for genteel, white, elite families such as the Dyes at the time. It's really important that you showcase your standing in the community through your home and its material goods. And so these are just examples of, for example, 18th century dinnerware, most likely made in China, and then, as I said, shipped from China to England, and then from England to the Americas, winding up either in main ports like New York or New Jersey, but also in local shops across New Jersey as well. Almost every big town would have, a store where these imported goods would be sold. So these are typical examples of the types of things that would be on a table, not maybe for everyday use, but for when you were entertaining those guests and you wanted to, to impress, as I said. And I did a lot of research into the consumer goods at the time because Dimension is very interested in doing programming related to what we call material culture, to how stuff matters. And so I found a lot of advertisements from 18th century newspapers from either New York or New Jersey shops advertising a variety of stuff, right? And I don't want to get too much into the weeds of this, but there would be a large variety. So, as I said, China and this is interesting, we call it China even to this day, because China is typically porcelain, right? Porcelain plates that were first and best manufactured in the 18th century in China, right? So that's why even to this day we call it fine china, because it came from China initially. And the most popular form of china or porcelain at the time typically had these blue and white patterns, right? And you can even see on this one, hopefully you can still hear me, the motifs are Chinese, right? This is like a little, Chinese house, right? It's sort of showing ships. So even the designs of the platters were meant to show that they were from China because that was sort of, the most popular thing at the time. But you also had maybe a little bit more affordable, a little bit more durable types of dinnerware available. And the most popular was what was often called Delft, which was typically made in the Netherlands and places like that. Sturdy, it typically tried to mimic those blue and white colors, right? Because those were the ones that were very popular and you wanted your stuff to at least, match or coordinate, right? But you can see that even in this one advertisement, it's saying we have China, which would mean glass, stone, Delftwares of all kinds, and at all price points, right? So you might have the more affordable stuff for your everyday use. You might save that fancier stuff, for the holidays. A lot of us do that even today, right? Just another example of more perhaps utilitarian, practical items that would show up in a family household. Those pewter plates that we saw on the top of the kitchen, those are going to be much more durable, right? Those are probably going to be your everyday plates that you're going to use because if you break them, they're not going to shatter and, crash to the floor in the way in which that fine china would. So any household would have a mixture of the fancier stuff and the more practical stuff. And again, you would almost see those distinctions between the kitchen and the family parlor, and the curators at Dimension do a really good job of attuning to this. So in the kitchen, you see that's where your pewter plates are, that's where maybe even some local stoneware pottery would be, but in your living room, that's where you would have your fancy china, presumably imported from China, your more ornamental candlesticks, right? Your fancier tea set, your best furnishings would be in your parlor, right? Because that's where you would want to make people feel as most welcome as possible. Now, this is all very important because in the decades leading up to the American Revolution, one of the key points of tension, starting in the 1760s, are fights over stuff, right? It's about, we often say it's about taxation, but it's about what's being taxed, right? A lot of the colonial protests were protesting, in particular in 1767, the Townshend Acts, which were basically putting a tax on all that stuff I just mentioned. Those plates, those books, those looking glasses, fabrics that were coming in, all of that was now being subject to additional import duties, right? Additional taxation, leading colonists to want to boycott, right? I will say the word boycott did not exist in the 18th century. It's actually a word that isn't invented till later on. So they would have called them non-importation agreements, a very kind of clunky phrase, but so I don't have to say that, like, blah, blah. I'm going to call them boycotts, right? Because that's what they were. But again, women are the primary purchasers of their family systems, right? They're also the primary producers of stuff, right? They're the ones that would be making candles and clothing and stuff if you wanted to make that stuff instead of buy that stuff. So to have women actively involved and supporting these political protests that are being offered throughout the 18th century is very, very critical. And what we see if we look very closely is that the 18th century folks knew this. They knew this very well. It's like sort of the historians that kind of forgot about it for a while, right? But if you go into the actual primary sources, there are tons of direct appeals to women, right? And I just want to show you a couple of them. So this is a broadside that was, it's from Boston, but it's great because it says right up in front, it is desired that the sons and daughters of liberty not buy anything, right? So in this case, this is someone who's continuing to import from Britain during the attempt to boycott. And so the patriots, the sons of liberty, the daughters of liberty are kind of sending a warning. Like, this guy is still doing business with England. We're trying to boycott them, right? We're trying to protest the Townsend Acts. So we are asking the sons and daughters, don't buy anything from this shop. This is not good, right? And really, to make the boycott succeed, they needed women who would, A, agree not to buy that stuff, right? To not buy the fancy cloth, to not buy the fancy linen, to not import things like those luxury plates and dishes and teaware that I mentioned, to not import other household items. So women as consumers kind of have to step up and make different choices about their purchasing power, but then they also were asked to step up as producers, right? If you can no longer import your fancy cloth, you still need to wear stuff, right? You still need clothes, right? So then women are more called upon to make more goods for their families, not just clothing, but tablecloths and linens and all the sort of things that would go into running an 18th century household. And so I should have mentioned earlier, and you saw it in the previous slides, if you go to any 18th century historic home, there's going to be a spinning wheel, right? Like, it's every 18th century home is going to have a spinning wheel because that was so ubiquitous, right? Women being the ones who would take linen and turn it into cloth so that you could make dresses and suits and tablecloths and bed linens and napkins and everything from it. That was something that women always did, right, in their households. But during the years leading up to the revolution, this took on a new level where women were asked to do it and asked to do so for political causes and then celebrated for doing so. So women engaged in what were called public, they were often called spinning matches or spinning bees or spinning parties, where instead of just the one woman in her home alone sitting at her spinning wheel working, women would come together and drag their spinning wheels across town, which couldn't have been easy, right? And kind of stage these deliberate efforts, these deliberate spinning bees or spinning matches to produce homespun cloth that would be a signal of your support of the patriotic cause. And again, if you look at the newspaper advertisements of the time, we see numerous accounts celebrating women, saying, like, here's one that happened, between 50 and 60 daughters of liberty engaged in this, and even goes on to say that how many, they spun 193 skeins. I don't know if that's impressive. It sounds impressive, right? And that it was, reported on as news, right? And so it was seen as a patriotic political activity, right? And we also see other appeals to patriotic women. This is a poem that appeared in a 1760-something newspaper. Apologize, I don't have the exact citation. Directly said, addressed to the ladies, right? So calling women out again for their role. And in this case, this poem is asking women to, again, participate in boycott movements and to directly connect those boycotts to the patriotic cause, right? So no more ribbons wear, nor in rich dress appear. Love your country much better than finer things, or than fine things. Begin without passion will soon be the fashion. To grace your smooth locks with a twine string, right? So they're asking women to give up those fancy silk ribbons that they would have used to decorate their hair that probably would have come from Paris or England and been made of like a very luxurious soft fabric, and instead use a local twine string, because that would be a fashion choice that would also be a political, signal, right? If you walked into a party, you could tell in the, in the 1760s and 1770s, what someone was wearing would often give away their political allegiance, right? If somebody was in a party and perhaps wearing a very fancy dress, such as on the left, something that would have been imported with silk and, other elaborate fabrics. This would be what most people would be wearing all of the time. And, especially elite families like the Dye families, right? They probably would have had their fabrics and dresses imported. Well, the fabrics, probably the dresses would have then been made, either locally or through a dressmaker in the colonies. But what happens in the late 18th century is, again, this promoting of homespun. I was trying to find an image. It's like really, really hard to find an image. So the closest thing I could get was, this is on the Colonial Williamsburg website, kind of signaling like one of those spinning matches or spinning bees. And you can see that the historical reinterpreters are dressed, their fabric, their clothing is more plain than this elaborate dress. So if you walked into a fancy 18th century party and somebody was wearing a fancier, a plainer dress, or a dress made of homespun cotton, that would be a woman's way of sort of today, like wearing a political t-shirt or something, right? They would kind of be signaling very subtly, but everyone would be in the know and understand this. So again, it reminds us that something like fashion that we often think of as very frivolous, right, and very superficial and very individual, in the 18th century, fashion was deeply political. It was connected to the revolutionary movement. Everybody there knew it, right? As I said, you could see all the newspaper advertisements directly reporting on this, and it's a really important reminder that everything has a history, right, and that this is like a really good way into kind of understanding the sensibilities and the milieu of the time period. The other most significant way we see women participating in these pre-revolutionary activities is through tea. Now, I love coffee, right? And if you took away my coffee, I don't know. That might test my revolutionary principles, right? But in the 18th century, tea was the most popular drink, right? And again, most of it was actually made in, British holdings in, places like colonial India and other parts of Southeast Asia. It would be shipped to England and then through England to the colonies. There's also a lot of smuggling going on, right? But the main point is 18th century Americans loved their tea, absolutely loved it. And it was the beverage of choice, but it was also central to their social patterns, right? So if I invited you over to my house, I would bring out my fancy tea set. I would bring out my fancy tea table. I would, there would be all these rituals about how the tea is poured, how the tea is made, right? It was a big deal, right? And again, so when you're asking colonists to boycott tea and to boycott the pretty stuff in which tea is served to impress your guests, you are directly involving women into political and patriotic activities. And so one of my favorite objects that I love to teach with is a teapot that exists in it's at the Smithsonian right now, I believe. And this is a teapot that was made, we don't know exactly when, it doesn't have like a timestamp, it's definitely made after 1766 and probably, within a year or two after, because it's celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was passed in 1765, putting a tax on any paper goods. It was very unpopular and quickly repealed in 1766. What's so interesting about this teapot, which says, no Stamp Act on one side and America, liberty restored on the other, is that, there are a couple of things interesting about it, but one is that this teapot was actually made in England. So, some factory in England understood that Americans love our stuff, right? And so we could kind of sell stuff. It doesn't mean that this factory was like pro-American liberty. It might have just meant like they wanted to make some money off of this, political controversy. We don't know. We don't know enough about how or why it was made, but we do know that it was made in England to be sold in America, because it's very unlikely that somebody sitting in, the countryside in England would care about a, Stamp Act repeal teapot, right? Now compare that again to all the other teapots I've been showing you all day, or to this image of a representative teapot that's actually part of the Dye Mansion collection. Imagine you are a woman who's invited your guests to, to company, to an elaborate tea party, and this is the teapot you pull out. Right? Without saying a word, you are making a pretty bold statement about your family's political loyalties. And obviously it's a a conversation starter, right? No one's just gonna like sit there and say, okay, pretty flowers, right? It was probably designed to get people talking, right? Now, there's no evidence whatsoever that the Dye family had this teapot, right? I don't have any evidence like that whatsoever, but it's interesting because, again, it's just an important reminder of the many different ways through their consuming patterns, through their production patterns, and then through their social patterns, how women could signal their allegiance to the patriotic cause in the 1760s and 1770s as we get closer to revolution. And again, we see this in poetry, another poem from 1768, again, directly calling the Daughters of Liberty. And I love this one because it speaks to women's lack of actual political power at the time, right? Let the daughters of liberty noble arise, though we have no voice, we have no actual political power, but the use of taxables, let us forbear, stand firmly resolved and bid Grenville, the parliamentary, I'm forgetting the thing, prime minister, right? Then rather than freedom, we'll part with our tea, right? So again, love your country better than fine things. Love your country better than your tea. It's a tall order to ask people to love their country more than their tea. Like I said, you'd have to pry my coffee out of my hands in the morning, right? But it just shows you the importance of this. And then this image that I have in the upper right-hand corner, we've never been able to verify this, scholarly wise, but this is a story that has existed in local legends and children textbooks since the early 19th century. The image depicts Susan Boudinot, who is a 9-year-old girl at the time. She is the daughter of Elias Boudinot, who's a New Jersey patriotic figure who's serves in Congress and the Army and everything. So as the story goes, the Boudinots are invited to William Franklin's house. William Franklin at the time is the son of Benjamin Franklin, the royal governor appointed, by the crown for New Jersey. And while there, the family is offered a cup of tea, as would be the custom, right? And so as the story goes, 9-year-old Susan Boudinot takes her tea, politely takes it and curtsies, as would be the proper thing to do at the time, walks it across the room, and tosses it out a window, right? So again, we only know this story through lore, but it's in like all these 19th century children's textbooks that I've looked at, right? So it's a story that has a lot of power and resonance because it reminds us that, women and children were part of these brewing, pun intended, tensions that led to the American Revolution, right? And then when we finally do get to the American Revolution and like sort of back to the Dye family, right, it's really important to recognize, and in New Jersey in particular, in this part of the, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the war came to people. Whether you liked it or not, the war often showed up right in your backyard, right? And particularly in New Jersey. Your house could be used as a military headquarters, right? A battle could be staged right outside your house. This is actually outside of Philadelphia in Germantown, where the Battle of Germantown took place, right outside somebody's family home, right? Troops across the area would regularly come into your town or your village or your farm and either politely ask for supplies for which they would compensate you or just forage and take them, right? So you could not escape the war if you were living, particularly in New Jersey, right? Where there was so much military engagement and so much, encampments here, right? The, military headquarters in Morristown over the winter and stuff. So there was like sort of no way of escaping the war, even if you wanted to, if you lived in New Jersey, basically, right? The war came to you, and not just on the battlefronts, it literally came to your house and your backyard, right? So women became directly involved oftentimes, whether they wanted to or not, right? And that kind of leads us back to, where we started, right? Is places like the Dye family home would be used as military headquarters, but they were still a family home, right? And if we look closely, we can see that there are always women present. So even in this sort of depiction of the military headquarters showing Washington with his, leading officers strategizing outside the home, we see a couple in the background just walking, just reminding us that this was still a family home, right? This was still a place where people were living and working. right? It was both a military headquarters, but it was also a family home. And for Dye Mansion in particular, what we happen to know is, if you ever visited, has anyone ever actually been to Dye Mansion? Maybe it's been a while because, like I said, it's been closed, right? But when you walk in, and this is sort of the long view of that earlier picture I showed you, right? When you walk in, there's this large, huge hallway, right? It's actually beautiful space. There's doors on either end, which would have provided great ventilation in an era without, heat and air conditioning. But what this grand hall also does is sort of divide the house in two. And so what we know is that basically when Washington showed up, that's what happened. The house got divided in two. So if you walked in through the front door, and I'm guessing, I'm trying to, is this the front or the back door? So we're just going to pretend it's the front door, right? This side of the house, the right side of the house, was given to Washington. It had slightly better, shutters on the windows, and the two rooms on that side actually connected, so it provided kind of more privacy, enabled him to do business with his aides de camp. And then the other side of the house would have had that family parlor that I showed you earlier, and then another area for sitting and entertaining. So basically what happens is, while Washington is encamped there, the Dye family has to give up half their house, right? And that's the side of the house that has their dining room, has, their Tunis's Dye's office, right? So they're suddenly kind of in cramped quarters. The hallway, I can only imagine how crowded and chaotic and busy this would have been. Probably a lot of meals would have been hosted here because the family dining room was now George Washington's office. I think I have an image of that. So this is, on the right side would be the dining room, now General Washington's office. On the left side would be the family parlor, where the Dye family probably retreated a lot to catch their breath and just kind of, get some peace and quiet in their own household. But that large hallway would have probably been where Washington and his officers dined a lot, right? Because he had several officers either staying there or staying nearby. They had foreign visitors visiting, trying to get support for the war. So, and we've staged events at Dye Mansion in this hallway. You put a couple of tables, you can fit a good 20 people around the tables, right? We actually did a workshop for educators a couple weeks ago there. So I imagine that this hallway became the place in which Washington and his men spent a lot of time, right? And now, as I said, we know that they kind of divided the house, right side Washington, left side Dye family, and, as I said, the parlor probably might have even at this time, there might have even been a couple of Dye family members who had to sleep there at night because the same division happened upstairs as well. They took the 2 bedrooms upstairs and gave them to Washington and his men, and then gave the other 2 rooms for the Dye family. So it would have been incredibly crowded. But there were also moments of overlap. I don't want you to think everybody stayed on this side and everybody stayed on that side, right? We know that the family and the general were friendly, that there were friendly interactions, that you don't, have even a military headquarters stay in your house for a month without some kind of interaction, right? And we have little fragments of evidence to support this. So this is a letter that was written by Jane Varick, who was a cousin of the Dye family, who describes her visit to Colonel Dye's house in October 1780, while Washington is there. And she says, I was surrounded by my headquarters acquaintances. So just this sort of, simple turn of phrase, my headquarter acquaintances, right? There's a sense of ownership. There's a sense of familiarity. My acquaintances, these are people with whom I have some friendly reaction with, not just oh God, the house is being overrun by military generals, right? So even what's not being said in this letter helps to show that there was, friendliness. There's interaction that's happening between the Dye family, their visitors, and then Washington and his commanders. We also know that, as I said, the place would have been used to host wartime events. Now, unfortunately, there's no evidence that Martha Washington ever stayed at Dye Mansion when Washington was here. She spent about half of her time during the war visiting Washington and other places. Like, this woman got around a lot. So, she frequently came to his winter encampments and to other places, as did a number of officers' wives. And the presence of women in places like military headquarters, such as the Dye family residence, as well as, Washington's winter headquarters. As I said, there was one in Washington, in Morristown, the Ford family mansion. These balls and tea parties and dances that would be held were also politically significant, especially when we were courting the French, for military assistance and supplies and stuff. The need to sort of create a warm, welcoming space had diplomatic significance as well. And the presence of women at these events was a signal, right? That, look, even our wives are willing to give up the comforts of their own home to come to our military encampments, to come to our headquarters, because this is a cause they believe in. They think it's worth fighting for. And so we're calling upon you for your support. So again, don't underestimate the importance of those practices of sociability, those rituals of parties and gatherings and dances that serve political and diplomatic purposes, in addition to just providing some moments of respite and relaxation, during stressful war times. We also know that women are very active and available in fundraising campaigns throughout the war, and including New Jersey women, who are collectively referred to as the Ladies of Trenton, but they are active across the entire state. And we know that Tunis Dye's wife, Hester, and his daughter-in-law are directly involved in this cause. So that there is supposed to be a slide that actually shows, it's like one of the smoking gun pieces of evidence from this article that actually lists Mrs. Colonel Dye, Major Colonel Dye. So we know for a fact that the Dye family women were directly involved in these fundraising activities. That gives us a good sense of kind of the variety of activity that the Dye family women would be engaged in. Before I conclude, because I want to leave plenty of time for questions, I also just want to remind you that there would have also been numerous women outside the grounds. These would have been women referred to as camp followers, sometimes the wives or sisters or relatives of soldiers, but oftentimes other just women who were in financial destitution and needed a way to make a living. So women would, go along with the army wherever they went. Wherever the army marched, women marched. They cooked for the army, they did laundry for the army, they often served as healers or nurses. They were provided rations by the Continental Army. They were kind of begrudgingly recognized for the important work. There's a whole series of correspondence of Washington sort of complaining about these women, but then by the end of the war, recognizing that if he didn't give these women provisions and support, that he would lose soldiers, right? So this is a quote from Washington writing to Robert Morris in January of 1783 saying, "I was obliged to give provisions to the extra women in these regiments or lose by desertion, perhaps to the enemy, some of the oldest and best soldiers in the service," right? And if you, and there's just really tons of evidence hiding in plain sight if you look at the military correspondence from Washington and his quartermasters. Each regiment would kind of get a number of women rations, and there was always sort of more women than rations, and so there were always these sort of push and pulls about sort of how much support should be given to women, in the army. And sometimes even soldiers would pay them extra if they did, particular mending or, additional food or preparation for them. And when Dye Mansion does outside events in the spring and summer, they often include exhibits, with camp followers. So these are a couple of photos. This photo kind of shows that. I thought I had another one, but I think I took it out because I knew I was going to be running late. And then, most of us are familiar with the legend of Molly Pitcher. I think she even has her own rest stop. I was driving somewhere and I saw the Molly Pitcher. I think it was on the turnpike. I can't remember where I was driving, right? So, so there's no person named Molly Pitcher, right? Historians think her story was inspired by this New Jersey woman, Mary Hayes Macaulay, whose husband was at the Battle of Trenton. Macaulay was probably already there as a camp follower, and as the story goes, when her husband is injured, she kind of takes over running the canon, but the point is she was already there. She didn't just she wasn't sitting at home knitting and got the news that her husband was injured and then stepped up. The legend of Molly Pitcher sort of leaves out that fact that her and thousands of other women who are unnamed and unsourced were already there on the battlefield in the military encampments, doing the hard work of helping support the Continental troops and the militia, and doing so openly, right? They weren't hiding, right? There are a couple of exciting examples of women who did hide, right? There's a woman named Deborah Sampson who actually enlisted in the army as a man and fought until she was injured, and then in the process of receiving medical care for her injuries was discovered she was indeed a woman, right? But the story of Deborah Sampson is much more exceptional, right? This idea of a woman masquerading herself to be a man, in order to fight as a soldier. What was much more common were the many women who would just be openly traveling with the armies as part of, as camp followers, helping to provide essential services. And these are more images from an outdoor encampment event that was held at Dye Mansion. And I'm going to leave it there, right? Because I think I'm going over and I want to make sure we have plenty of time. So I think this slide is just to sort of remind you. So the women of Dye Mansion, as uncomfortable and tedious as it might have even been to have, an extra 20 house guests showing up for a month, they still had a lot better than the women who were outside in a tent, having to be with the army under much more roughshod conditions. But it's a very important reminder that even at a place like Dye Mansion or another military's headquarters, it isn't just the women of the family whose lives would be upended and affected by the presence of military headquarters. It would be women who served as camp followers and who were actually actively engaged in military, kind of keeping the military running, right? Because this was not a well-organized army, right? This was, there was no important bureau of, army affairs that would easily provide supplies and provisions. It was often a very catch-as-catch-can circumstance. So I want to thank you all, and I'm really excited that this exciting collaboration that I've been doing with Dye Mansion and my place at William Patterson now is extending to also include the Wayne Public Library. So I love that we have these three organizations so geographically close to each other, kind of coming together to support this really fascinating part of American history. So thank you all, and I'm very happy now to take questions. Yes, hi.
But my question is men.
Yes.
George Washington is in the Dye Mansion. How many other men would be staying in the mansion? Part of the entourage, aides?
Probably about half a dozen or so. His aides de camp, his closest military advisors would have been in the mansion, and they would have just been given one room for all of them, right, and not even a big room. So just imagine those very cramped quarters. And then in addition, as I mentioned, Washington typically always traveled with 30 or 40, they were called his lifeguards, right, his personal bodyguards. They would probably not be sleeping in the mansion per se, but they would be kind of stationed around, making sure, no attacks were made on him. But then we also know that, Lafayette and other generals had headquarters all kind of within a mile or two of Dye Mansion and other places. So it would have, so maybe half a dozen or so sleeping there inside, another 30 or so sleeping outside, 100 sleeping, in the surrounding fields. Picture the current golf course would have been just, tents of troops. And then, but then, as I said, you would nearby would have lots of other people like Lafayette. So during the day, there'd be even, maybe as much as, 20 or so officers and stuff visiting him during the day. Sure. Mm-hmm.
How many children, well, let's start, how many pregnancies would a upper-middle-class woman have? How many children would she have?
So typically at the time, anywhere from 6 to 10 was common. The Dye family themselves had, I think, 8 children. At the time, most of those children were adult children. But if I actually have this as a note. So we know at the time that Washington was staying there, Hester, Tunis's wife, was there, along with her daughter-in-law, Hannah, who was married to, and she had 3 young children who was actually staying at the house while Washington was there. So again, just adding to the chaos. And then I think another one of their adult daughters was also staying there. So the Dye family had about 8 children, which was very common at the time. Their children were grown at the time of Washington's visit, but they did have 3 grandchildren living with them at the time that the house was used as military headquarters. And that was very common at the time, and those were very demographic, averages. After the Revolution, actually, one of the things that happens is that families start to get smaller. So you actually see from like 1800 on, just families getting smaller and smaller, this sort of small, slow demographic shifts. But in the 18th century, large families were very common. There were often infant mortality, right? A person might give birth to 8 children, but maybe only 5 or 6 of them would, survive to adulthood. But very large families were the norm. Yes.
How dangerous was it to be a camp follower?
Yeah.
You had battles, they were unarmed.
Yeah, I mean, they were in the thick of it, right? They went wherever the army went, right? So, and they had they were often just marching right alongside the army and, had all those supplies, right? Hopefully there was like wagons and stuff for the big kettles and stuff for the laundry and cooking and stuff. But yeah, it was incredibly backbreaking, hard labor in, really outdoor, living in a tent, living outside. And yeah, you were always subject to danger because you were marching with the army. So if there was a skirmish or, a surprise attack, you were right there in the thick of it. So yeah, it was, and most women who served as camp followers tended to be women of, lower working class women who really were there because, maybe there's like some romantic story of like some woman who just didn't want to be separated from her husband. But in most cases, it was more likely like with the husband or father fighting, there was no way to keep the family farm going. There was no source of income. And so it was largely economic necessity for a lot of these women, or women who were not attached to a particular man, who just understood that this could be a way to make a living, not an easy way to make a living, but could be a way of supporting themselves during times where, especially in a place like New Jersey, the war was here. It was very visceral, right? People were, could have their house upended or their crops destroyed or, their family home disrupted. So oftentimes women were forced to do this, whether they wanted to or not, which would be very different than someone like Martha Washington or, Henry Knox's wife, Lucy, who made the choice to visit their husbands at their military encampments. And those were choices they were making to support the war effort, to support their husbands. So very different circumstances. But there were always lots and lots of women in these military places, which I think is just an important part of the story that, that needs to be recognized. Great question. Yes.
Were these women paid?
The camp followers were given rations, right? And sometimes they were paid. So they weren't, like, they didn't receive, like, a payment, like an official payment from the army, like a salary. They received food rations, like room and board, what we would call it. But they were often paid by individual soldiers if they took on extra work. So if a soldier asked them, could you mend these shirts for me? Or can you, sew something for me? They often received individual payments from individual soldiers, but they would have to sort of barter and negotiate those individually. There was no, you get X number of dollars per month or whatever, right? So, yes.
What kind of health or staff or slaves did the Dyes have?
That's a really great question, and I actually meant to talk about it, and I forgot, so thank you. It's hard to know for certain because the records don't exist, but we know from what records do exist that the Dye family probably had at least 2 or 3 enslaved individuals living and working in the family home during the time of the American Revolution. We actually know one of them is a woman whose name is Phyllis, and we know this because she shows up in Tunis Dye's will, right? He makes some provision for her in his will when he dies. So we know that they have at least one enslaved woman who's living and working at the mansion at the time, and she's probably the one doing, the fires and the waters and the cooking and the cleaning and the more sort of backbreaking labor that would be necessary to help keep an 18th century household like the Dye mansion running. But even even Hester Dye and her children, her daughters, would be expected to do other work. There's no way to kind of do everything that's needed to make a household run without everybody pitching in, but a lot of that more taxing, backbreaking labor would have been done by Phyllis. And It's possible that often we know from other studies of colonial America that often women would kind of just come in for a few days to kind of help. Like if a woman was trying to do, like get their cloth spun for, the winter for their family, they might hire a couple of young women from the neighborhood or something for a couple of weeks to come in and assist and things like that. So we know that there were these sort of fluid labor arrangements that happened as well. But yeah, the Dye family, like most New Jersey families of the area, had at least a couple of enslaved individuals, and that would have been common for most elite families in New Jersey, particularly at the time, this was considered part of Bergen County. We didn't have a Passaic County then. So Bergen County in particular actually had one of the highest levels of slaveholding in New Jersey before the American Revolution. So,
There were workers.
yes. Yeah, there were workers and farms, and presumably like tenant farmers kind of thing. Like, if they had 600 acres, and I think that, don't count me, like that number might not be exactly accurate, but I believe that's very close to what the holdings were at the time of his death. So it's very possible that on those 600 acres, there would have been a couple of tenant farmers who might have lived in their own sort of smaller houses, on that part of the property, and helped to tend the fields in exchange for, they shared the profits and things like that. That was a very common way of organizing larger farms in the north, right? So, across New Jersey and New York, these sort of tenant farming operations were very common. So presumably that was also the case for the Dye family.
You said that Evans was there for 2 separate.
Yes. So he was there in the summer. I think it was like June and July of 1780, and then he came back in October of 1780. And when he came back the second time, that was sort of when all of the chaos around Benedict Arnold was happening, and there was a lot of tension, and like didn't know who to trust, didn't know what was happening, and so part of the reason what people, historians suggest, and I'm persuaded by this, is that the George Washington already knew that he could trust the Dye family. They already had a relationship. They had already spent time there just a few months earlier. So they return, and he returns in October 1780. It's a testament to how much trust and faith he must have had in Tunis Dye and his family to go there during one of the most sort of disruptive, chaotic, really kind of tough times for the Army. I think his stay at the Dye Mansion was much more favorable than, for example, like the Ford family mansion, and I don't think anybody enjoyed that stay. Right? There's a couple of letters that suggest that nobody was happy with that arrangement. We don't have any letters of complaint from the Dye Mansion. Again, we don't have many letters at all, but we don't have for the Theodosia Ford, I believe is her first name. There's a couple of letters where she's just like, and then afterwards she's like, when am I going to get paid for this? So the lack of those kind of documentation suggests that the arrangement of the Dye family must have been amiable, must have been mutually agreeable to both parties, and must have been secure and happy enough that, as I said, Washington trusted them when he needed a place to stay relatively quickly when there was this major crisis happening in October of 1780.
Had a choice, or would somebody come in and say?
Yeah, not really. I don't think you had much of a choice, right? It's a great question, because even I have found, because I was trying to do research of other families in the area, and there's one example I found of where Washington only stayed for a night someplace outside of Philadelphia, and the family did not want him there. They were they were actually Quakers. They were trying to stay neutral. They didn't like the idea. This was their summer residence being used for anything military. They were not happy. He only stayed one night, but it doesn't seem like they had a choice for that. So maybe he wanted to stay longer. They were able to talk him out of staying longer, but often families didn't have a choice. The Dye family was actually very lucky in that it was Washington who, stayed, because it could have been just as likely that, if the British Army were in command of this area, they would have just taken it over, and they would have had very little choice in that matter, right? So they were actually quite fortunate in a sense that it was General Washington, the highest ranking military figure, and not just, the enemy, or, maybe a lower level officer who might not have commanded as much respect, and treated the place as well, so. Right.
Were the Washington and the men who stayed within the house, did they get fed by the family, or were they pretty self-sufficient?
They were pretty self-sufficient. We know that Washington typically traveled with like his own servants and stuff. We actually know that Washington traveled with an enslaved man, Billy Lee, who served as his butler, but that Washington also kind of had his own kind of cooks and stuff with him. And we know that more from like I said, at the Ford Mansion in Morristown, he actually, like, because he was there for the whole winter, he actually like built his own kitchen. Like, could you imagine like somebody's coming to stay at your house and being like, it's not good enough, I'm gonna like, add a room in the back, and so yeah, so most of the time the cooking of the meals and stuff would have been done by his, like, his version of his camp followers. Obviously they, more official. But presumably, I have to imagine that if you show up at someone's house and you come, that the people who are living and staying there also have to, in some way, whether it's just getting the water or making sure the fires are tended or whatever it is, that it would have created extra labor for the women and the servants of the Dye family as well. Great questions.
Were they compensated in any way?
The Dye family? That's a great question. They should have been, right? Because that was often the case, right? That when Washington used a household as, I'm not sure we have like the smoking gun records. I haven't done that deep a dive into the research yet, but that's something I'm actually very interested in exploring. Like I said, but we do know, like for example, there's much more research has been done on the Ford Mansion, and better records exist for that. We do know that they were compensated. We know that they should have been compensated. That was the way it was supposed to work, right? So presumably yes, but that would be if it was a formal arrangement. As I said, there's lots of evidence of just what was called foraging that would happen from both sides of the armies, because there was plenty of British troops coming around here, and sometimes if your farm was foraged, you were not compensated at all, and sometimes you were just raided. Like sometimes you had absolutely no choice in the matter whatsoever. So it really did depend on the circumstances, your loyalties, but hopefully, a house that was officially commandeered as a military headquarters would have received some compensation for that. So, yes.
Wasn't money pretty tight growing?
Yeah, money. I was just going to say money was pretty tight, and then it would also depend on how you got paid. If you got paid in continental currency, it was worthless, right? The wartime inflation was so terrible that the continental dollars that were issued by the fledgling U.S. government were pretty much useless by the time the war was over. So you would want to get paid in like, gold or silver. Right. Exactly, yeah. So money was in short supply, inflation was rampant. You would probably want to get paid in either gold or silver, or you would want to get paid in stuff. Like you would want, here's X, barrels of flour, or here's, here's a horse, or here's a cow or something, right? Because that would have more value in a way that the currency was often in short supply and, subject to really rampant inflation. So, great questions. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You've been a very attentive audience, and hope you enjoyed. And like I said, Dye Mansion is open again, so when you get the chance, go and take a look, because they're doing some really good stuff there.